The day the world almost ended. And no one knows about it. On September 26, 1983, one man had his finger hovering over a button that could kill 300 million people. He had seconds to decide. And every piece of evidence told him to push it. This is the story of the day the world almost ended. And you've probably never heard of it. The year is 1983. If you think today's world feels tense, you need to understand what tension actually meant in the Cold War. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, controlled enough nuclear weapons to extinguish human civilization multiple times over. Not once. Multiple times. We're talking about 20,000 warheads pointed at each other's cities, military bases, and population centers. The philosophy was simple and terrifying: mutually assured destruction. Mad. If one side launched, the other would launch back before those missiles even landed. Everyone dies. No winners. No survivors. Just ashes. But 1983 wasn't just another year of Cold War posturing. It was different. It was worse. The Soviet Union was led by Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chief who was sick, paranoid, and convinced the Americans were planning a first strike. In his mind, it wasn't a question of if the West would attack, but when. Months earlier, in March, President Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire in a speech that echoed through Moscow like a declaration of war. Then in September, just weeks before our story, a Soviet fighter jet shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing all 269 people on board, including a U.S. congressman. The world exploded in outrage. Reagan called it an act of barbarism. The Soviets insisted the plane was a spy mission. Trust? There was none. Communication? Barely functional. Both sides were locked in a death stare, waiting for the other to blink first. And into this powder keg walked a man who never wanted to be there in the first place. His name was Stanislav Petrov. Lieutenant Colonel. 44 years old. An engineer, not a soldier. A man who loved classical music and hated the military bureaucracy that had swallowed his life. Petrov was supposed to be developing software, not sitting in a bunker deciding whether civilization should continue to exist. But the Soviet military had other plans. They assigned him to Serpukhov 15, a secret base just outside Moscow. Serpukhov 15 wasn't just any base. It was the nerve center of the Soviet Union's early warning system, codenamed OKO, the Eye. This was where satellites in space watched the United States for any sign of a nuclear launch. If American missiles ever left their silos, this bunker would know first. And whoever was on duty would have minutes, maybe 3, maybe 5, to decide whether to alert the Soviet military command to launch a counterstrike. 3 to 5 minutes to decide if the world should end. Petrov hated this job. He later said he felt like a cog in a machine, powerless and insignificant. But on the night of September 26, 1983, he was the cog that mattered most. His shift began just after midnight. Routine checks. Stale coffee. The hum of computers. Another night in the bunker, watching for an attack that, hopefully, would never come. The room was underground, sealed behind blast doors. No windows. No sunlight. Just the glow of radar screens and the constant, mechanical breathing of the Soviet Union's electronic watchdog. Petrov settled into his chair. His team around him, young officers, barely out of training, watched their screens in silence. Everything was calm. And then, at 0015 hours, the alarm went off. The sound was unlike anything else on Earth. Not a beep. Not a buzz. A scream, electronic, piercing, designed to cut through sleep, through shock, through every human instinct that says, this can't be happening. Petrov's blood turned to ice. Missile launch. High reliability. His team froze. 20 pairs of eyes turned to him. He was the duty officer. The decision was his. The protocol was crystal clear, drilled into every Soviet officer from their first day. If the satellites detect a launch, you report it immediately to military command. No questions. No hesitation. You pick up the phone and you tell them that the Americans have fired. And then the Soviet leadership decides whether to launch everything they have in response. To strike back before the American missiles land. To end the world in the next 20 minutes. Petrov's mind raced. His training screamed at him, report it. Follow protocol. This is what you're here for. But something felt wrong. Status report, he shouted over the alarm. Where is it coming from? A young lieutenant's voice cracked as he read from his screen. Montana, sir. Single missile detected. Trajectory confirmed. Impact estimated in 18 minutes. One missile. From Montana. From Malmstrom Air Force Base, one of America's primary nuclear launch sites. The room held its breath. Here's what you need to understand about nuclear war in 1983. Nobody launches just one missile. It makes no sense. It's not how it works. If the United States was going to attack, they would launch everything at once, hundreds of missiles, maybe 1,000, to overwhelm Soviet defenses before they could respond. A first strike means you go all in. You don't send a single missile and give your enemy time to destroy you. One missile could be a test. A malfunction. A mistake. But Petrov's system was telling him this was real. High reliability. The satellite was sure. And the satellite didn't lie. It couldn't. It was a machine. It saw infrared signatures, the heat bloom of a rocket motor igniting. It calculated trajectories. It reported facts. Except machines do lie. Or rather, they make mistakes. Petrov's mind split into two voices. One voice, the voice of his training, his duty, his fear, screamed, this could be real. What if you're wrong? What if it's the beginning? What if more missiles are coming and you waste precious seconds? The other voice, quieter, steadier, the voice of an engineer who understood systems, whispered, this doesn't make sense. Why one missile? Why just one? Sir. Another officer's voice cut through his thoughts. We're reading launch plume confirmation. The satellite has visual confirmation. Not just a sensor reading. The satellite actually saw it. The alarm kept screaming. Petrov looked at the clock. 90 seconds since the first alarm. 90 seconds of the most important minutes in human history ticking away. He needed more information. Check ground-based radars. Do we have confirmation from other systems? His second-in-command shook his head. Negative, sir. Ground radars show nothing. But they wouldn't see it yet, the missile is still in boost phase. That was true. Ground radars couldn't see over the horizon. They'd only pick up the missile when it reached the top of its arc, minutes from now. By then, it would be too late to decide. The satellite was their only eye. And right now, that I was telling them the world was about to end. Petrov's hand hovered over the phone. The direct line to Soviet military headquarters. To the commanders who would wake up General Secretary Andropov. To the men who would open the briefcase with the launch codes. One call. That's all it would take. And then the alarm went off again. Second missile detected, the lieutenant screamed. Malmstrom again. High reliability. Petrov's stomach dropped into a void. 2 missiles now. 2. Still not enough for a real first strike. But 2 was worse than 1. 2 suggested intention. 2 suggested this might be the beginning of something larger. Keep tracking. Petrov ordered. His voice sounded distant, like someone else was speaking through his mouth. Watch for more. 30 seconds later, a third alarm. Third missile. 3 confirmed launches. Then a fourth. Then a fifth. 5 missiles. All from Malmstrom. All headed for the Soviet Union. All confirmed by satellite. All showing high reliability. The probability of 5 false alarms happening simultaneously? Astronomical. Impossible. Petrov stood up. His legs felt like water. Around him, his team had gone silent except for the mechanical reporting of data. They were all looking at him now. Waiting. 23 years old, some of these kids. Barely old enough to drink. And they were watching him decide whether their parents, their siblings, their entire nation would exist in 20 minutes. The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. If he reported this and it was real, he'd be a hero. He'd have given the Soviet Union a chance to strike back, to not die defenseless. If he reported this and it was false, he would start World War III over a computer error. 300 million dead. Maybe more. Cities turned to glass. The sky black with ash. Human civilization snuffed out because he made a phone call. But if he didn't report it and it was real, if those missiles were actually coming and he stayed silent, then the Soviet Union would be destroyed without warning. The leadership would die in their beds. No response. No retaliation. He'd be the traitor who let his country burn. Every option led to catastrophe. Every choice was wrong. This is what the Cold War really was. Not speeches and spy novels. This. A man in a bunker with incomplete information in seconds to decide whether the human race should continue. 3 minutes had passed since the first alarm. 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. Petrov picked up the phone. And then he put it back down. "It's a false alarm," he said. The room erupted. "Sir," with respect, the young lieutenant's voice trembled. "The system shows high reliability. 5 confirmed launches. We have to report this." Petrov turned to face him. His voice was steady, but inside, his mind was screaming with doubt. "The system is wrong." "How can you know that?" another officer demanded. "Sir, this is exactly what an attack looks like. We're trained for this." How could he know? That was the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The truth was, he couldn't know. Not with certainty. Not with the kind of proof that would satisfy a court or a tribunal or the generals who would demand answers. But he knew in the way an engineer knows when something doesn't add up. In the way your gut tells you the math is wrong even before you find the error. 5 missiles, Petrov said, his voice cutting through the noise. From one base. Does that sound like an American first strike to you? Silence. The officers looked at each other. The Americans have over 1,000 ICBMs, Petrov continued. Submarine-launched missiles. Bombers. If they wanted to destroy us, why would they launch 5 missiles from Montana and then stop? Why give us time to respond? It was a gamble. A terrible, terrifying gamble built on logic and intuition and a gut feeling that the machines were lying. But sir, the lieutenant pressed, the satellite confirmed visual contact. It saw the launch plumes. That's not a sensor glitch, that's actual infrared imaging. He was right. That was the part that made Petrov's decision nearly impossible. The satellite had supposedly seen the missiles with its own eyes, so to speak. Heat signatures don't lie. When a rocket motor ignites, it burns at thousands of degrees. The satellite's infrared sensors were designed specifically to detect that heat bloom against the cold background of space. So either 5 American missiles were actually in the air right now, arcing through space towards Soviet cities, or something else, something the designers never anticipated, was creating heat signatures that looked exactly like missile launches. Petrov made his choice. He grabbed the phone, not the red one to military headquarters, but the internal line. Get me the satellite operations team. Now. While Petrov waited for the connection, his mind raced through everything he knew about the OKO system. He'd helped develop parts of it. He knew its strengths. And more importantly, he knew its weaknesses. The satellite network was new, only operational for a couple of years. State-of-the-art Soviet technology, which meant it was groundbreaking in theory but rushed and imperfect in practice. The system had never been tested in actual combat conditions. How could it be? The only way to test it for real was to have someone actually launch nuclear missiles at you, and if that happened, the test didn't really matter anymore. Satellite Ops, Lieutenant Petrov speaking. A voice crackled through the phone. This is Colonel Petrov at Serpukhov 15. I need orbital position and sun angle for our bird that's tracking Sector 7. Right now. One moment, Colonel. One moment. Petrov didn't have one moment. He had maybe 15 minutes before those supposed missiles would start their terminal descent. 15 minutes before the Soviet leadership would demand to know why they hadn't been warned. Visual, large Soviet military clock on the wall, second hand sweeping forward, time-lapse effect showing the passage of seconds, urgency emphasized through motion blur, asterisk. Around him, the command center remained frozen in a kind of horrified limbo. The alarms still screamed. The screen still showed 5 missiles inbound. But Petrov hadn't made the call, and without his authorization, the information went nowhere. His team was watching him with a mixture of awe and terror. Some looked at him like he was a madman. Others like he was a prophet. Nobody looked at him like he was just following protocol, because he wasn't. He was making it up as he went along. Colonel Petrov? The voice came back on the line. The satellite is currently at orbital position November 7 Alpha. Sun angle relative to target zone is approximately 35 degrees above the horizon. Is there a problem with the data feed? 35 degrees above the horizon. Petrov closed his eyes. There it was. Listen to me carefully, Petrov said into the phone, his words coming faster now. At that angle, is it possible the satellite's infrared sensors could be picking up sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds? Colonel, the system has filters for solar interference. That shouldn't be possible. Shouldn't be, Petrov repeated. But is it possible? I suppose if the cloud formation was at the right altitude, and the ice crystal density was high enough, and the angle was just right, theoretically, you could get a heat signature that might look like a missile launch. Petrov finished. It was a 1-in-a-million shot. A perfect storm of conditions. The sun at exactly the right angle. High-altitude clouds composed of ice crystals that could reflect infrared radiation. A new satellite system that hadn't been programmed to recognize this specific type of false positive. And it had happened 5 times in a row because the satellite was tracking across the same region of sky, seeing the same clouds from slightly different angles, interpreting each reflection as a separate missile launch. The machine wasn't lying. It was just wrong. Visual, artistic illustration of the Soviet satellite looking down at Earth, its sensors illustrated his eyes, seeing missile launches that aren't there, almost tragic personification, painted in melancholic blues, asterisk. Get me verification on ground radar, Petrov said. If those missiles exist, the ground stations should be picking them up by now. Stand by, Colonel. Petrov turned back to his team. Every eye in the room was on him. They'd heard everything. Some of them looked relieved. Others looked skeptical. One officer had his hand on his own telephone, clearly debating whether to go over Petrov's head and report the launches himself. Ground radar is negative, the voice came back through the phone. No contacts. No missiles. Nothing in Sector 7, nothing anywhere in tracked airspace. Negative. No missiles. Petrov felt something release in his chest, not relief exactly, but a lessening of the crushing weight. He wasn't certain yet, but the pieces were fitting together. Keep monitoring, he ordered. Report any changes immediately. He hung up the phone and looked at the clock. 8 minutes since the first alarm. If those were real missiles, they'd be past the point of no return now, arcing over the North Pole, beginning their descent towards Soviet territory. We wait, Petrov announced to the room. We watch the ground radars. If missiles are coming, we'll see them in the next 5 minutes. And if we don't see them, an officer asked quietly. Then I just saved us from starting World War III over a reflection. And if we do see them, the young lieutenant whispered. Petrov didn't answer that. Because if they did see them, then he'd just condemned the Soviet Union to die without warning. The missiles would hit in 12 minutes, And the leadership would be sitting in Moscow with no idea they were about to be vaporized. The room fell silent except for the diminishing wail of the alarms, which someone had finally turned down to a low pulse. Officers returned to their stations, but no one was looking at their screens anymore. They were looking at the clock. 5 minutes passed. The longest 5 minutes in human history. Nothing. No missiles appeared on ground radar. No impacts were detected. No nuclear fireballs bloomed over Soviet cities. The alarm on the main screen began to blink, not with new warnings, but with a system query, error check. Awaiting confirmation. The satellite system was starting to realize it had made a mistake. Petrov sat down heavily in his chair. His legs were shaking. His hands were trembling. He'd been operating on pure adrenaline and logic for the past 13 minutes, and now that the crisis was ebbing, his body was remembering how to be terrified. "Stand down from alert status," he said quietly. "Log it as a system error. Report to headquarters that we experienced a false alarm due to satellite malfunction." The room exhaled. Officers slumped at their stations. They just stared into the abyss. And the abyss had blinked first.